Jamie McLaren, Ewan Doyle, and the Feeney family, names that once echoed quietly through Scotland's traveller communities, suddenly became symbols of fear, betrayal, and a war that would tear the countryside apart. What started as a stolen van spiraled into a deadly feud, leaving blood-broken families and chaos in its wake. This is the story of Scotland's most shocking traveller gang war. Scotland's countryside always seemed peaceful to outsiders, a place where winding roads cut through green hills and quiet villages. But beneath that calm surface lived a community that few truly understood. Travelers, with their caravans and convoys, had been part of the land for generations. They lived by their own rules, working trades that kept them moving, dealing in horses, clearing scrap metal, and sometimes turning to riskier ways of making money. To those on the outside, the sight of their encampments was ordinary. Yet inside, tensions had been growing, slowly and silently, for years. Family pride was everything. Each group wanted to show strength, to prove they could not be crossed or cheated. Old grudges, often forgotten by most, lingered like smoke after a fire. A disagreement at a horse fair, a bad debt never paid, or even an insult thrown years before could lie dormant, waiting to resurface. Among these families, memory was long, and forgiveness was short. For a time, these grudges stayed behind closed doors. They were muttered about over campfires or argued over during long drives, but never allowed to boil over in full public view. That uneasy balance could not last forever. The younger generation, restless and eager to make their mark, were less willing to let things slide. They grew up hearing stories of past fights, of nights when their fathers or uncles stood their ground with fists, chains, or blades. To them, those stories were not warnings. They were lessons in pride and survival. So when the smallest disputes began to rise again, the younger men were ready to turn them into battles. Villagers and townsfolk who lived near encampments often felt the edge of that tension without fully understanding it. They noticed more caravans moving through than usual. They saw cars gathering at odd hours on back roads. They heard shouts carried on the night air, arguments sharp enough to cut through the silence. But because life went on as normal during the day, most shrugged it off. After all, travelers had always had their arguments, and it rarely spilled into the open. Yet under that ordinary rhythm, something dangerous was building. The families had reached a point where they no longer trusted each other, and no one wanted to appear weak. A look at the wrong time, a careless word, or a minor theft could be enough to shatter the fragile calm. Like storm clouds hidden behind a blue sky, trouble was gathering. There was no single event that marked the beginning of what was to come. It was a combination of pride, history, and unspoken threats. Each family kept its own secrets, storing weapons, making alliances, preparing for a future they believed was inevitable. The countryside remained beautiful, the villages still quiet, but beneath it all, something was ready to erupt. No one outside the traveler world saw how close things had come to breaking apart. They would soon learn that the calm of Scotland's hills was only a mask, and the storm waiting behind it would be unlike anything the country had ever faced. It often begins with something so small that it hardly seems important at the time. In this case, it was a van, old, rusted in places, and worth little on the open market. But it belonged to one of the most respected traveller families in Scotland. Inside were tools of the trade, collected over years, each with a purpose for work that kept the family moving from town to town. When the van went missing from a lay-by on the outskirts of a small border town, it might have been dismissed as just another theft. But in the traveller world, every act carried weight, and nothing was ever seen as random. To the family who lost it, the theft was not about the value of the van. It was about respect, about someone daring to cross them. Suspicion fell almost immediately on a rival clan. They had crossed paths many times before, clashing at markets and fairs, glaring across fields during horse deals. The two groups had always been careful to avoid open confrontation, but each carried a long list of reasons to hate the other. When whispers spread that the rival clan had taken the van, it was as good as confirmation. In the traveller world, A rumor was often treated as fact, and pride demanded action. The first response came not with fists or blades, but with warnings. Tires were slashed on caravans parked outside the rival's yard. Windows were smashed under the cover of darkness, glass littering the ground like scattered warnings. By morning the message was clear: the theft would not go unanswered. For the rivals, this was not just vandalism. It was a challenge, a public statement that they had been marked. Retaliation was no longer a choice but an expectation. Within days, the small border town found itself gripped by unease. Locals noticed groups of men gathering on street corners, their cars parked in long lines with engines running. Families stopped attending fairs, keeping their children close. Shopkeepers closed earlier, uneasy with the sudden tension that seemed to settle in the air. Everyone could feel something building, though few knew the details. It was no longer just a stolen van. It had become the spark that would light the fuse of something far larger. The rivals struck back quickly, breaking into a yard late at night and torching scrap metal piles that belonged to the accusing family. Flames lit up the sky, and the smell of burning metal drifted for miles. Fire crews worked into the early hours, but by then the damage had been done. The scrap business was ruined, and the message was unmistakable. The feud was no longer hidden in whispers. It was a war announced in fire. By now both families had crossed the line of no return. Each believed the other had started it, and each was determined to prove strength through violence. What began as the loss of a single van had transformed into a test of pride, with both sides unwilling to step back. Scotland's peaceful countryside was about to witness its first taste of traveller war, and the echoes of that spark would be heard for years to come. The first real strike of the Traveller War came suddenly, as though the weeks of tension had been leading to this very moment. It happened on a narrow country road, bordered by hedges and farmland. Far away from police patrols and busy towns, the rival family had been traveling in a small convoy of cars, thinking the road was quiet and safe. They were wrong. From the darkness behind them, headlights appeared, first 2, then 4, then more. A convoy of vehicles surged forward, boxing them in, cutting off every possible escape. The air was thick with the sound of engines revving, tires screeching, and metal grinding against metal as cars swerved dangerously close. The ambush was swift and brutal. Men jumped from their vehicles armed with iron bars, machetes, and chains. They smashed windscreens, tore open doors, and dragged their enemies out onto the tarmac. The quiet countryside exploded with violence. Shouts, screams, and the metallic crash of weapons rang out into the night. Blades flashed in the beam of headlights, and every blow seemed meant to leave a permanent mark. By the time the attackers pulled back, several men were left bloodied and broken on the road, 2 unconscious and 1 struggling for his life. When local farmers discovered the aftermath in the early hours, they were horrified. The road was littered with shattered glass, twisted metal, and pools of blood that glistened under the rising sun. Abandoned cars sat with doors hanging open, evidence of a battle fought with savage determination. It was no longer possible to pretend the feud was contained. This was an open act of war, carried out with military-like precision. The police arrived quickly, but the attackers had vanished back into the night, leaving behind chaos and confusion. Paramedics worked desperately to save the injured, rushing them to nearby hospitals under heavy police escort. Rumors spread immediately, traveling faster than official reports ever could. Families across Scotland woke to phone calls warning them that the feud had turned violent, that there would be more blood, and that no one was safe if they were connected to either side. The incident shocked local communities. For decades, many had heard whispers of traveller rivalries but rarely seen the violence spill out so openly. Now the evidence was undeniable. Pictures of wrecked vehicles circulated on social media before authorities could even confirm the details. People speculated about who had organized the attack, who had been targeted, and who would strike next. In pubs and shops, conversations were hushed but urgent, with everyone convinced the worst was yet to come. For the families involved, the battle on the back road was only the beginning. In their eyes, the fight had not ended with broken bones and bloodstains. It had only set the stage for a deeper, more dangerous war. The attackers saw their strike as a message, proof of strength and fearlessness, but for the victims, it was humiliation that demanded revenge. Neither side was willing to back down. In the silence that followed the clash, Scotland stood on the edge of something darker, waiting for the next explosion of violence. Fear spread quickly after the roadside ambush. What had once been quiet villages and towns near traveler camps were now filled with whispers, suspicion, and unease. People who had never thought twice about seeing caravans pass through began locking their doors earlier in the evening. Every sound in the night, an engine on a distant road, the bark of a dog, the bang of a dustbin lid suddenly felt like a warning that more violence was coming. Communities that had lived side by side with travelers for years were now gripped by anxiety, uncertain of who might be caught in the middle of the feud. It did not take long before the violence moved closer to everyday life. Petrol bombs were hurled at parked terraces, lighting up the night sky with sudden bursts of fire. The smell of burning fuel lingered long after the flames were put out, a reminder that the feud was not going away. Families packed up quickly and moved under the cover of darkness, driving convoys to new locations in hopes of avoiding attack. Some left behind smoldering shells of caravans too damaged to save. For the travelers, constant movement was already a way of life. But now it was driven not by tradition but by fear. Children were pulled out of schools without warning. Parents refused to risk sending them into classrooms, afraid that enemies might use the opportunity to strike. Teachers noticed the sudden absences, but explanations were vague. No one wanted to speak openly about the war, as though even naming it aloud might bring danger closer. In many traveler families, silence became a kind of armor. They kept their plans secret, told their children to stay inside, and trusted no one outside their circle. The surrounding villages felt the impact too. Local shopkeepers noticed groups of unfamiliar men, buying supplies in bulk late at night. Farmers reported strange vehicles parked at the edges of fields, their engines idling for hours before disappearing. Residents who had once stopped to chat with travelers at markets now crossed the street to avoid them. The sense of mistrust grew heavier each day, poisoning the small acts of neighborly life that once tied the countryside together. Police patrols increased, but their presence did little to ease the fear. Officers could not be everywhere at once, and the travelers knew how to vanish before the flashing lights arrived. Every fresh attack seemed to happen in the blind spots, on quiet lanes or in darkened yards just out of sight. The police stations were flooded with reports, but few witnesses were willing to give names. Everyone knew that speaking out could invite retaliation, and in a war built on honor and revenge, no one wanted to become the next target. In just a few short weeks, what began as a single theft had transformed the atmosphere of entire communities. The countryside that once seemed peaceful now felt dangerous and unpredictable. Caravans parked on the edge of villages were no longer just homes on wheels. They were symbols of a feud spiraling out of control. Families who had lived in the same places for generations now moved like shadows, carrying with them the weight of fear and the knowledge that the war was only beginning. The violence had reached a point where the authorities could no longer stand by. Scotland's police forces, long used dealing with petty crimes or occasional disputes among traveler families, now faced a full-scale feud that threatened to engulf entire regions. Reports of attacks, arson, and injuries poured in from towns and villages across the country. It was clear that traditional policing methods would not be enough. A coordinated effort was needed, and soon officers from multiple units were brought together to track the movements of the rival families and anticipate their next strikes. Surveillance became a top priority. Drones hovered over rural highways and open fields, recording convoys of cars that carried weapons and men ready for battle. Plainclothes officers staked out petrol stations, markets, and fairs, noting patterns in travel and supply. Every caravan, every temporary encampment, was monitored for signs of escalation. Yet, despite the growing presence of law enforcement, the feud continued. The traveler families were experts at disappearing into the countryside, moving quickly and leaving little trace behind. For every ambush foiled by police, another one seemed to occur elsewhere, unpredictable and brutal. The first weeks of the operation were filled with frustration. Officers watched from afar as rival convoys skirted towns and villages, skirting cameras and avoiding checkpoints. Every night brought new reports of attacks, caravans set on fire, vehicles vandalized, and men beaten or left unconscious on roadsides. In Dundee, one of the most shocking clashes occurred. More than 50 men arrived at a scrapyard, armed with chains, clubs, and axes. The CCTV footage captured a scene that resembled a medieval battlefield more than a modern crime scene. Sparks flew from metal hitting metal, and the sounds of shouts and blows echoed into the surrounding streets. Police arrived minutes too late to prevent the carnage, finding only wreckage, blood, and terrified witnesses. Despite the chaos, authorities were determined to regain control. Intelligence gathering became crucial. Officers interviewed families, checked mobile phone records, and traced vehicle movements. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was treated as vital. Some officers even embedded themselves in local communities to gain trust, hoping that someone might eventually come forward with critical information. But the traveler code of silence was strong, and fear of retribution kept most people from speaking. The media began to report on the escalating feud, drawing national attention to a conflict that had previously been confined to rural areas. News headlines described it as a war on wheels, a battle that seemed unstoppable and frighteningly organized. For ordinary Scots, the countryside they thought they knew became a place of uncertainty. Parents warned children to stay indoors, and locals learned to travel cautiously, never knowing when a convoy might pass by with hostile intentions. Even with increased police presence and surveillance, the war raged on. For every convoy intercepted, another found a different route. For every fight broken up, another erupted elsewhere. Scotland had entered a new phase, one where law enforcement could watch and follow, but not always prevent. The spiraling violence, the traveler feud, had grown beyond petty arguments. It had become a battle that tested the limits of authority, patience, and the resilience of communities across the nation. The traveler war had already taken lives, shattered families, and filled Scotland's countryside with fear. But the conflict reached an entirely new level when betrayal entered the equation. One member of a prominent gang, a man known for his cunning and careful planning, made a choice that no one could have predicted. He approached the police, offering inside information on the movements, hideouts, and leaders of the rival groups. At first the authorities were cautious. The traveler code of silence ran deep, and they knew that relying on one insider could be dangerous. But the man's intelligence was precise and detailed, mapping out convoys, identifying weapon caches, and naming key figures. For the police, it seemed like the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Yet the betrayal was never about loyalty to the law. The man had his own agenda. He sought to use the authorities to eliminate his rivals, consolidating power for himself while appearing cooperative. Every tip he gave, every location he revealed, was calculated to weaken the enemies while keeping himself out of immediate danger. Police raids followed, and for a time it seemed that the strategy might work. Safe houses were raided, weapons were seized, and arrests were made. The rival clans were shaken, unsure who could be trusted and who was working with law enforcement. But betrayal in the traveler world carries consequences far heavier than in other communities. Those who break the unspoken rules are not simply punished, they are erased. Weeks after providing intelligence, the insider was found dead, his body buried in a shallow grave on the outskirts of Glasgow. The scene was brutal, a stark message to anyone else thinking of cooperation with authorities. He had underestimated the code of revenge that still governed the families he sought to manipulate. His death sent ripples through both clans, fear, anger, and uncertainty. If someone could be killed for betraying a gang, who could be trusted and who would be next? The betrayal also caused panic among law enforcement. Officers who had once believed that insider information could help contain the feud now realized how volatile the situation had become. Trust between police and potential informants weakened, and strategies had to be reassessed. The authorities were reminded that in this war, nothing was straightforward. Every move had to be calculated, and even careful planning could be undone by the unpredictable human element. For the clans themselves, the betrayal hardened resolve. They became more secretive, more violent, and more determined to assert dominance. No longer would they rely on intimidation alone. Swift and merciless retaliation became the standard. Old rivalries, long simmering beneath the surface, reignited with new intensity. The death of the traitor served as both punishment and warning, demonstrating the lengths to which these families would go to protect their pride and maintain their code. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the Traveler War had grown beyond simple disputes or petty revenge. Betrayal had added a lethal complexity, turning strategy into survival and suspicion into a weapon. Every convoy, every yard, and every hidden corner of the countryside could now conceal danger. Scotland's Traveler feud had entered a darker, deadlier chapter, one in which even loyalty could not guarantee safety, and trust could be fatal. The feud had already left a trail of blood across Scotland, but the climax came in a place that should have been sacred, a funeral. It was meant to be a quiet farewell for a respected elder of one of the Traveler families, a man whose life had been devoted to tradition and the well-being of his people. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most violent confrontations the country had ever seen. Word had spread among the rival clan that the gathering would be an opportunity to strike, and they arrived prepared. Weapons were hidden in coats, under jackets, and inside vehicles, ready for the moment when tension would boil over. The funeral began with solemnity. Families gathered around the grave, offering prayers and mourning quietly. But beneath the hushed tones and tears, the air was thick with suspicion. Every glance toward the rival clan was measured, every movement watched. Fear had taught these families to expect betrayal at any moment, and the funeral was no exception. No one spoke of retaliation, but everyone felt it was inevitable. The first attack came suddenly. A car pulled up at the edge of the cemetery, and men jumped out wielding chains and clubs. Panic erupted immediately. Mourners scattered in all directions, children screaming as adults tried to protect them. The sound of metal striking metal rang out as makeshift weapons clashed, echoing across the gravestones. Fists flew, and the first few blows left men unconscious on the grass. Within moments, what should have been a place of remembrance turned into a battlefield. The violence escalated rapidly. Some attackers had brought firearms, and gunshots cracked through the air, sending survivors diving for cover behind tombstones and vehicles. Blood pooled on the ground, mixing with dirt and fallen leaves. By the time it ended, the cemetery looked like a war zone. Several men lay injured, some critically, and a few would not survive the night. Vehicles were overturned, and the echo of shouts lingered long after the attackers disappeared. The chaos left the local community in shock, and police who arrived on the scene could only survey the aftermath, too late to prevent the carnage. The funeral massacre had far-reaching consequences. For the families involved, it was a turning point. Pride and revenge became inseparable, and the code of honor dictated that those responsible for the attack would not go unpunished. The wider public began to realize the feud was not just a private dispute. It had grown into a public threat capable of spilling into towns, villages, and any place where the clans might cross paths. Fear became a constant companion, and the notion of safety seemed almost meaningless. This brutal climax also changed how the police approached the feud. Surveillance increased, and strategies became more aggressive. But the unpredictability of the families made containment nearly impossible. Each side learned from the attack, preparing for the next confrontation, and leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. The funeral massacre was more than a tragedy. It was a symbol of the feud's unstoppable momentum. Scotland had witnessed its darkest chapter yet, and the violent echo of that day would continue to shape the conflict for months to come. The aftermath of the Traveler War left Scotland reeling. Dozens of arrests were made in the weeks following the funeral massacre, But the damage could not be undone. Families were fractured, with homes destroyed, caravans burned, and lives lost. For many, the grief was compounded by fear. Survivors moved constantly, avoiding places they once called familiar, fearful that revenge could strike at any moment. The countryside that had once seemed serene now carried a heavy weight of tension, and the people who lived there, travelers and locals alike, were left to navigate a world that had been irrevocably changed. Communities tried to return to normal, but the scars were visible everywhere. Schools reported declining attendance as parents kept their children home, worried that even routine travel could expose them to danger. Local shops and businesses that once welcomed the presence of traveler families now operated under a cloud of apprehension. Streets that had echoed with the laughter of children and the sounds of everyday life were now punctuated by the distant rumble of convoy engines and the uneasy quiet of watchful eyes. Fear had become part of the landscape, an invisible barrier that altered the rhythm of life in the countryside. Within the traveler families, the feud had permanently shifted the balance of power. Alliances were forged and broken with alarming speed, often determined by who had survived and who had lost members in the conflict. The deaths, injuries, and betrayals of the previous months had left deep wounds, and trust became nearly impossible. Every iteration was measured, every conversation carefully guarded. Older generations, who had hoped to preserve tradition and stability, found themselves powerless against the younger men who were determined to assert dominance at any cost. Pride and revenge were inseparable, ensuring that the possibility of future violence remained. The police faced a complex challenge. While arrests and raids had temporarily disrupted the clan's operations, the war had exposed the limits of law enforcement in controlling a feud built on generations of rivalry. Intelligence gathering and surveillance remained vital, but officers understood that containment alone could not resolve the underlying issues. Even months after the most violent confrontations, investigators reported isolated skirmishes, attacks on property, and threats against witnesses. The traveler feud had demonstrated the difficulty of imposing order on a community governed by its own rules and codes of honor. Media coverage of the war left a lasting impression on the public. Newspapers, television, and social media recounted the horror of the funeral massacre, the roadside ambushes, and the shocking acts of betrayal. To many outside the traveler world, the events seemed almost unimaginable, a glimpse into a society where loyalty, revenge, and pride dictated life and death. Yet for those involved, these events were not extraordinary. They were the tragic consequences of a culture that valued honor above all else. Ultimately, the traveler war serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly a conflict can escalate when pride, vengeance, and betrayal collide. The stolen van, once a minor incident, had ignited a chain reaction that swept across Scotland, leaving destruction and fear in its wake. Families were torn apart, communities scarred, and lives lost. Even today, the feud remains a whispered warning, a story passed down in hushed tones that shows how hidden rivalries, once provoked, can explode with consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. Scotland had survived the storm, but the memory of the traveler war lingered, a permanent shadow over the countryside and its people.